I want to start off, though, by talking a little bit about how you ended up doing what you do and what we know of your work. One of Terry Rafferty's great lines, which he's allowed me to share, has to do with the fact that you managed to find yourself in one of the least opportune areas of endeavor. He said, next to the poet and the philosopher, the puppet animator has to be one of the least remunerative and potentially successful career choices. And I'm curious if you just chart a little bit for us your training, which is in the graphic arts, and your eventual movement into working with the film camera.
Go. We started off training at the Philadelphia College of Art in illustration, and then we did postgraduate work in London at the Royal College of Art doing the same thing. But in the meantime, we were doing, we had an inkling for doing some cutout animation, and again, it was that slight feeling of being frustrated by the frozen image, and Paul Clay's famous line about taking a line for a walk is something that I think any animator takes pretty seriously. And it basically started off that way. And well, you sort of don't know where you're going. You just drift and you try things out, and that's it.
What actually prompted you, though, to get a movie camera? Because it's a rather unwieldy apparatus. I mean, it's referenced often in your films. Your films seem to be so obsessively about the kind of mechanical age, and the film camera being the last machine.
I think we weren't even thinking about that then. No, I think that we'd seen animation. I mean, when we were in Philadelphia, we had a couple of really fantastic theaters, and you could see all the best of European animation, particularly Central Europe, Polish or Czech animation, and we could see the Russian cinema, the Czech cinema, and the French. It didn't matter. So we had, everything was at our fingertips, really, in terms of being provoked, and I think that we'd seen quite a bit of puppet animation, although I think that we probably weren't really conscious of it, but I think it must have nagged at us. But because it was too formidable a technique at the time, that we just stuck with, we did cutout animation, so it was more or less on the line of collage figures, but it was a way of learning, coming to terms with the technique of single frame animation. And what then happened was that then in England we continued with animation, and then we asked a friend of ours who was in the film department, could he smuggle out a Bolex over the Christmas holidays. We had this little idea, and over the Christmas holidays, which are rather long in England, we did our first animation film, and it was cut out, and that's the way we did. That's the way we approached animation. So we've never officially been through a film school. So don't worry if you've never been to a film school. Take heart. And that's the way we really approached animation. Was just always this little ambushes on the rental department, and we did 3 films like that at the Royal College. I think the first one cost £20, and the next one cost about £30. And then we came back to America. We thought we had to pay off the debts, and for 6 years we sort of vegetated. And we ended up, one of us was a waiter. We washed dishes, and then I moved up to being a waiter. My brother decided to do typography for the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia. And a friend of ours in Holland said, listen, if you're washing dishes in in America, washed them in Holland. And we said, that's pretty sensible. So we cleared out. And that's how we went to England. And on the way into England, we made a pit stop to visit a few friends, and then Keith Griffiths, whom we formed Conic with, was at art school with us in London at the Royal College, and he was now at the British Film Institute. And he said, put in a script. Why don't you put in a script which is has experimental draped around it? And so we said to ourselves, well, we've never done a puppet film. That was our idea of being experimental. And that's how it happened. We literally drafted a script in like a couple of days, threw it in at the BFI, and went to Amsterdam to wash dishes. And 6 months later, we got the go-ahead that they would go through with the script. And then we suddenly said, so how the fuck do you do a puppet film? And we had to completely learn the technique off the ground, because there's no books that say, how to make an armature, how to do this or that. And you learned under fire. So we winged it. And all the early puppet films are us desperately coming to terms with the technique.
I have to ask you, did you, as young men growing up in this country, did you see like the Ray Harryhausen films and the kind of versions of animation? I mean, besides the sort of Warner Brothers cartoons, I mean, did you see any of the ones that might be stop motion that might be a kind of reference point?
I think we must have seen them, but we
saw them,
didn't realize they were animated.
I think they were real for us. We just said, they really are skeletons.
How did they train that monkey to do that? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I think instinctively we realized that films like that were just, they were special effects, and animation was meant to be invisible, and we sort of thought we weren't into skeletons at that time.
Well, actually, let me ask, since those films are not available, and I understand that we would have been unlikely to get really the early films, maybe Timothy, give us just, this sounds really yes, but give us a storyline on one of those early cutout pieces, the sort of those first few things you did with the borrowed Bolex.
The borrowed Bolex was a trapeze film between two a man and a woman, and the ultimate thing that happened was, as she did a triple and a half somersault, grabbed his knees and they broke, and he just went down with the knees.
Did that
have a happy ending?
Did that have a title?
It did, but it wasn't a very interesting title.
I'm going to move us up a bit, and I have to say one of the things that we're doing is we're very much condensing so much of your work in both the retrospective and in tonight's program. There's clearly a whole period of apprenticeship where you're learning the craft, and Terry Rafferty really moves us up to the point where you're working already with 35 millimeter. But I'm curious to just get a sense of what was the critical and, if you want to call it, popular response to those early 16 millimeter films that you did? I think a brilliant film on Stravinsky, another film on Janacek. Were they seen on television in England, or were they seen in cinemas? What sorts of notice did those films produce?
They were the Stravinsky and Janacek diptych were commissioned by Channel 4. They probably went out at midnight, for all we know. I'm sure they did, or close to it. And they were very marginalized. They didn't get a TV it was unheard of to have a cinema showing. They were just totally obscure. That's all. Just and it was one of the earliest. I think it was one of the first 6 commissions made by Channel 4 was this one on this Stravinsky and Janacek, and
they realized it wasn't good to do it again.
But the interesting thing about even the approach, and this is where Keith was quite critical, because Keith, as a producer, was. Although he studied film and is a filmmaker in his own right, he had a very fantastic antennae for fielding what was really happening in England. And we're sort of two guys who work with our heads very close to the table, and the focus is very shallow. But Keith has to have these fantastic antennae, and he was the one who, when we drafted the project for the Stravinsky and Janacek, he said, listen, if we approach the funding bodies through, say, the animation department, which normally you say, okay, animation is for kids, it's the 10 o'clock slot, but Channel 4's brief was always that in this situation, that it would be a much more for adults. I mean, it would be considered as almost artistic. But Keith said he was a little bit afraid that it would get lost in the shuffle, and he said, let's approach it through the drama department, which was a very intelligent approach, and they got off the ground on because TV loves biographies. They love it. They gulp it up. And I think in this sense, we threw them two eccentric biographies. And I think when Channel 4, when it's a new commissioning body, they like to feel generous. And so they commission something totally obscure and off the wall. And that's
what they got.
That's what they got.
I'm going to ask a slightly gossipy question, and then we're going to take a look at the first of the excerpts. How did you gain the attention of Peter Greenaway? Because clearly Greenaway was interested in your work fairly early on, and what was the relationship?
I think Peter, because he was at the BFI, we were all sharing the same impulse, the first films generated from the BFI. And I think at that time we were doing a poster for him. And we just had a natural crossover there.
We did a lot of the posters for the early BFI films because, well, we had to make money. And that's how we first met Peter, was through that, yeah.
Well, we're going to have a chance to hear a little bit of Peter Greenaway's comments. The film I want to start with, I, Terry Rafferty, I impersonating Terry Rafferty, is your first 35mm film. It's also the first film of yours, I think, that went out on U.S. television as well as British television. It was part of a season of Alive from Off Center, actually out of this community. And it is a rather singular adaptation of a work by Bruno Schulz, which is very much about a particular place called Street of Crocodiles. And we're going to be starting almost 3/4 into the film, and I wonder if I could really, in a way, impose upon you to just describe maybe the opening aspect of the work and just give us a little bit of a sense of the film, and then we'll see this particularly, I think, really striking section, or Terry and I think striking section.
It's the crocodiles.
Yeah.
The
Taylor sequence, yes.
I haven't seen it for a while. I think it's the sequence where the stalker figure sort of is lured into the tailor shop, where he's sort of mulched by the attendants. That's it.
Okay. So why don't we see the segment from Street of Crocodiles?
I don't remember animating all that green stuff.
Yeah, when you're seeing this close.
Is that our print?
Yeah, there's a little Norman McLaren work going on top of your film. I can't help but asking when in seeing this, and maybe it's impossible to calculate, but how many days, how many weeks, how many months for the Taylor sequence to be?
About 2 days, right?
No.
It's about probably 3-4 weeks.
Yeah. The whole film took about
It's a year and a half to do the whole film.
And I've seen a portion of the set at the Museum of the Moving Image in London. How large is the figure, the central figure, who Peter Greenaway calls the Bruno Schulz figure? Uh-huh.
It's about that size. It's about a foot. That's a standard size for a puppet, because in terms of the relation to the arm's length and seeing the puppet's face and taking in the whole body, it's the best way to see him entirely.
I mean, in the sense of proportion, if the puppet's too big, you have to go like this, and then
It takes time.
Yeah, so you do it in proportion to just this. That's it. Yeah, but that's crucial because in terms of time, you suddenly realize that, I mean, we calculated that there was so much glass. We used real glass in the film and all the shop fronts, and as you saw there. And we think we spent about 3 months ducking because reflections in the glass. So we'd animate the scene and then we'd go down on our, like this and fire the camera. There's one scene where you see one of us just agitating like crazy because we weren't thinking. You sort of can't quite tell sometimes where the glass is reflecting, so it caught us.
Not to force you into too much of an interpretive gloss on it, but I mean, Greenaway has actually written a rather kind of brilliant piece on this particular film, and he actually makes the relationship between. This is a film about. Or it's based on a kind of memoir of a particular town in Poland that clearly there's a kind of both a kind of love and hate relationship that Bruno Schulz has. It's I mean, in your kind of final kind of epilogue, you talk about, or you kind of quote from the book that it's a city of cheap human materials, concession of our city to modernity and the metropolitan corruption, a place where nothing ever succeeds, and yet there's clearly a fascination. And I guess my question, and maybe by extension the Greenaway question, is what in London of the 1980s sparked this kind of, let's call it meditation, that would take you back to Bruno Schulz of the 30s, that kind of critique and yet deep affection for the urban experience?
Well, I think initially that when we approached the British Film Institute with this project, they had very specifically said to us that they would prefer us to adapt a piece of literature rather than us coming up with an idea all by ourselves. And so we said, we thought a bit, and then we just said, well, that's fine with us. We'll give you Bruno Schulz. And I think they just accepted that, well, they didn't have any choice, really. We wrote a script around the Bruno Schulz, which I guess must have appeared relatively as though it had something like a storyline for them. So they sanctioned it. But I think that our approach to the world of Bruno Schulz was that he was an author who, I'm going to improvise here, is that, I mean, he deals, what fascinated us about Schulz was his approach to, I mean, he would say it was the poetry of the everyday, the ascendancy of the everyday material matter, and creating almost a metaphysics out of the sheer physicality of, wood, oakum, sawdust. That side seemed to us to be the great privilege of puppets animation, and that's what that must have been an underlying impulse in our work, and it was something that we just wanted to explore with the project. And I think that every single project we've ever done in our life, I don't think we ever went in knowing how it was going to end or what the trajectory was going to be. We just knew that there would be a trajectory, that there would be something that we were on the hunt to explore, to experiment on certain elements, to trap certain things, but that was always a very organic process in which you had certain ideas, but of course you didn't know that if you arrived at this corner you're going to turn left or you're going to turn right, or whether there was going to be any light or no light. It was just something that was to be discovered, and I just, that's just the way we work, and yeah.
No, I have to say, Peter Greenaway really endorses this film. He has a very comical ending to his review. He says, "Read the book and see the movie." He brings up a couple of things I'd love just to get a sense of. I think there's a relationship in a lot of your work to not so much cinema, but pre-cinema. And Greenaway talks about the 3 M's, which I guess have to be like the 3 B's in classical music. The 3 M's for him are Muybridge, Marais, and Georges Méliès. And I think he finds in your work, particularly your work of this period, a rather striking relationship to the sort of direct experience of fascination with movement, to a willingness to use very modest materials to obtain that let's call it that effect, and a surprisingly contemporary understanding of the world that comes out of this particular practice, which seems so materially antiquated, but almost as a kind of inverse, seems so extraordinarily contemporary. And I guess to maybe ask a question of it, that pre-cinema, now you didn't have a traditional film school training, but was there for you a kind of interest in not so much Hollywood or the movies, but that kind of earliest form of movement?
But in the context of cinema and animation, it's the analysis of the frame. Because each time you make a single movement, you're projecting a trajectory of that movement. So in a way, it's very close to someone like Marais, or particularly Marais or Muybridge. And we knew Muybridge, but it's true at an art college level, you see that, but you never think that in terms of cinema that one day you might be animating in that same tradition. That's a post-analysis. We have to do a projective analysis going forward with the way a puppet is animated. So in a way, there's a nice parallel there. But it's something that we never actually thought of. But it's only when you say that, I think in hindsight, you say, yes, well, we have to analyze movement.
But I think also that you don't have to go to a film school to see the history of cinema, and we always haunted the cinema, so we knew the silent period. And for us, without saying that, oh yes, we're great fans of the silent period, as an apology, it was preeminently one of the great visual movements. I mean, what the cinema in the silent period did. And that's something that, as visualists ourselves, we were very open to and prone to, and it's only natural that we would have been struck by the power of the silent cinema, because you're very, in a sense, dialogue isn't foregrounded. In a sense, you have to read a movement. You have to see the way the filmmaker orchestrates the frame, how through the gesture, through his use of decor, all those elements are something powerfully employed by the, you talk about Karl Dreyer more now. I mean, we're not great fans of Eisenstein, but Dovzhenko, but just, it's tremendous, that work. And even more now is it the last laugh? No.
Yes.
Last Laugh is one of the first silent films to not even use one intertitle. The whole film is entirely a visual symphony. So, and I think animators by their very nature are people who are very powerfully concerned about movement, and they know how to make their images speak. They don't need necessarily, I mean, we're used to animators using dialogue, fine. We attach a great voice, like we hire some great voice to speak the role, but I think that's a way of selling animation. I mean, you find they're just characters attached to famous voices, and I think that belittles the great power of animation and puppets. We don't need a Paul Scofield. Nothing against Paul Scofield, but we don't need him to elevate the puppet. To elevate the puppet, yes, exactly.
Let me ask maybe a less profound question, and it's one that let me ask something stupid and reduce the level of discourse. Just as one could talk about going back and seeing in after all, the cinema was begun by brothers, the Lumiere brothers,
Yeah.
first people who picked up a camera and decided to make motion pictures. There's a figure like yourselves, an American who emigrated to England, who I think exists in some relationship to your work. Now, within the world of cinema, he's actually much better known, but I think within the kind of world we're talking about, there's more of a parody, and that's Terry Gilliam. And I'm curious whether or not there's a kind of affinity with his work, but more especially, much of his work really is an imagining of the future, the current 12 Monkeys, or I think a better example, Brazil, an imagining of the future, but trapped with the technologies that you are so much engaged with, which is really the technologies of the machine age, of the turn of the century. And I'm curious if you feel a kind of affinity when you see Gilliam's work.
And Terry's bigger than life, and we're much smaller than life, I think. But and we've met him a few times, and he wanted us to work on something once, and we thought, why is he approaching us of all people? And because the sketches that he did in front of us were just paralyzing. So we thought, why is he asking us? But this piece never went through. But on one level, I mean, what he's done with Monty Python even in England, has set such a precedent. And he's a public figure, and we're not public. I think that explains more the area that we tend to stand in.
Yeah, I mean...
we prefer the shadow.
Yeah. Small budgets for us.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move on to and look at a piece from a film made only a couple of years afterwards, but it's actually, I would say, for me at least, your most baffling film. I have to say, Terry provided me with lots of good turns of phrase. He says, murderously difficult movies. That was one I liked. And I think he used the word confounding 2 or 3 times in the same sentence. And I would say if there had to be a film that I would attach those kinds of descriptions to, it would be Rehearsals for Extinct Anatomies, which we're going to see the very beginning of it. And let me tell you what Terry was interested in, and then I'd be keen to hear a little bit of your thoughts. He said that so much of the fascination of your work has to do with setting these beings, these kind of quasi-human, quasi-mechanical beings into motion. But what he found so interesting in this film, in Rehearsals, is that the first, say, 5 or 6 minutes is about setting the decor into being. And so it operates in a very different way, but also it's visually quite distinct. It almost divides in half between an extraordinarily bright, as one critic said, kind of almost like purely mechanical. There's no sense of the handwork that one feels in so much of your other work. And then the second half is very dark and very brooding, and there's a kind of metaphysical break that seems to happen in the middle. Any thoughts before we take a look at this one? Anything to make it less murderously maddening and confounding?
Well, at the beginning, this film came immediately after Crocodiles, and we realized that we didn't want to retrace through anything close to that kind of material. So we said we wanted to create something in black and white, and we wanted to do something very stylized, in which we had Leszek, who we've always worked with, musician, Leszek Jankowski. We'd had a project on Kafka, which Channel 4 rejected out of hand, and we said, fuck you. We got another idea, guys. And then we just said, we took the exact music that he'd composed for the Kafka, and we reworked it. And we said, as we always have the music first, even with Crocodiles, we always had the music first. And almost through all the films, that's been the format. We wanted to do something where we sort of said that was more or less that the scenario, if you can call it that, would obey the structures of music. It wasn't going to be. Would be a sort of visual work, but it would obey the laws of music, and we used the music as almost that it wrote the scenario. So it was quite at times abstract and very, how do you say, analogic. We sort of wanted to explore the way of using analogic space, and that's really how it all started off. So when we first started working on the film, we conceived of it as a series of very formal tracking shots in which the camera would go left, right, would go up and down, and then back and in, as though one continuous take for 14 minutes. And what we did is that we set the camera up and we ran it as far to the left as possible, and then we made a marker. And we said, that's how far the left-hand side of the set is. And then we tracked it to the right. We had a wide-angle lens on it. And in a sense, that set up the parameters. And we did the same thing when we tracked back and forward, up and down. We just created the total parameters. So it was conceived very powerfully from almost from a very formal side. The rest is all fiction then.
All right, why don't we take a look at this? Is Rehearsals for Extinct Anatomies. We're going to see about the first 5 minutes. One of the critics that I was reading on this particular film is actually really a remarkably good piece on you that appeared in the American Journal Film Comment. Talked about this being the most oblique of your films in terms of it not being grounded. I mean, you were sort of saying you had this idea for a Kafka film and they threw it out, and so you kind of cooked up this. Clearly, there's no pre-existing novel or story. What in that way begins to hold this piece together?
Originally, we started off with a piece by Fragonard, a painting called the Le Verrou, which is the bolt, which is in front of the door there. And that was the initial conception. It was a black and white engraving rather than the original painting, which was in color. And so we started off formally with this notion of black and white, and that we would create the birth of the line, so to speak, as in terms of the actual decor itself. Then we got derooted, as usual. We discovered there was another Fragonard, and there was a book, and a friend of ours, a French friend who actually, because partway through that sequence, our camera clapped out on us, and it starts to vibrate. And at that point, we panicked. And a friend in Paris came over with his Mitchell camera, and I think previous to that he'd brought a book called L'autre Fragonard, the other Fragonard, and this was the cousin who was an anatomist, and he'd done these. To this day, there's some discrepancy about how he's done it, but he dissected these bodies. In fact, a full horse and a full body. And they can be seen in this museum outside Paris.
It's a veterinarian museum.
And we went down to see this, and there inside a glass case was a full horse with a rider on it, in which it's completely dissected. The veins are completely exposed, full of they're either blue or they're red. And we suddenly thought, this is the secondary motif of this film. This became the anatomist side of it. And the anatomy side then became the dissection side. So I think we got totally derooted from the original impulse, and which then became the prelude of this film. The middle sequence, which with the man rubbing his head, which we haven't seen, was actually the original formal side of it. And then we attached this whole beginning onto it.
I'm curious, there's a kind of, this is really a very crude way of saying it, but a kind of 1930s feel, the kind of Oscar Fissinger, the kind of period of radiodynamics and the kind of hard edge abstract. I mean, I'm just curious, had you seen work like that and had that, I mean, you take I mean, what's amazing, it must be the first film in cinema history to use barcode. And you don't simply use it to say this is, this particular, this is this product, but you use it as a kind of dynamic element. And it's also perhaps your most, I guess what I'm saying is your most graphic film, maybe the film that has the closest relationship to your own training.
I just think that you set out initially that you set yourself certain parameters, and then once you set up black and white and that we were going to run rhymes, visual rhymes on the barcode and creating everything as though it was one of those old engravings, that everything falls into place. Once you set those parameters, it's wide open. The game's, I don't think we ever thought once about, I mean, we know Oscar Fissinger, but I don't think we never thought about that. They set themselves up, the rhymes. It's just that then you're off and running, and you just explore again. So
also, it's the property of when you look at any older engraving, there's no way that they can actually, or you really don't see it, that they blur that line. And with film, it became a sudden possibility with the sense of focus, that we could actually destroy the hardness of that line, and that became like a secondary attraction to it, to just the pure formality of the engraving line as being hard, black and white. We could find grays by changing our focus.
Now, if I were Terry, I would probably say, well, this film still remains baffling to me, but I did read a really intricate kind of unpacking of it, and I'll just kind of ask it in a very bold way, which is, in that same film comment piece, taking bits of what we saw, but also bits that happened later. That particular critic goes beyond the baffling and actually claims that the film is in some ways a very abstracted meditation on AIDS, because you do see very brief instances of syringes, and you see elements of the kind of apparatus of AIDS treatment. And I'm curious, was that at all part of the constellation of ideas that were in your mind during that period?
He was ahead of us.
First film with barcode and...
No, that's purely somebody's fantasy. His fantasy is worth as much as ours. So I don't. What can you say? It's fine. No, in a sense, you do work with a certain limited amount of a scenario. What you don't see in this film is this middle. You see, there's these two intense white rooms flanking this one central room, and the central room is very low lit. It's sort of what one would presume to be a relatively normal room with two inhabitants, and off to the two sides are sort of a metaphysical space, literally to the side, above and below. And the raw sort of scenario that we had was that there were these two fragile human beings in this sort of intimate space, but what you felt was that there was some unknown event that was being prepared in the wings. That's about as far as that was enough for us to then orchestrate this sense of something potentially that was being prepared in the wings, some event, a metaphysical event. It could be anything, but it was there being quietly prepared and unbeknownst to these two people. Although they had a slight intuition that there was something being prepared out there. That's as far as it went.
We talk about a museum of veterinary medicine. The next one we're going to look at is actually ostensibly from the Museum of Sleep. Now, what is the Museum of Sleep, and are we likely to see other motion pictures that come from that museum?
Well, originally this film was, we'd already been working on the scenario for the feature film, and literally almost, well, no, not literally, but after Crocodiles, we'd started working on the feature film project, Institute Benyamenta, although it was something that was a bit of a bluff and a joke. But Channel 4 at one point said, yes, we'll finance the development of the script. So the script was put into action, and then whilst doing the script, we did rehearsals, and then we did the Museums of Sleep, the Comb. And the Comb that was 1991, so that was 5 years after Crocodiles, and the feature hadn't come off yet. It looked like it was never going to come off. So we just said, let's do a sort of little dry run at certain themes in the feature, just to try things out. And so we worked up a certain theme from Robert Walser, who we based the feature film off of, one of his novellas. And it was just, again, exploring a territory that we weren't really sure of. We wanted to court the fairy tale-ish, not the fairy tale, but something like the fairy tale-ish. And we wanted to use a Sleeping Beauty sort of figure who was asleep, but we wanted to mix some animation, but we wanted to absolutely resolutely keep the live action sequences apart from the animation. But again, it was almost analogically cutting that no matter what the puppet did, or the puppets, that you felt that the human, the live action bits resonated, that each was aware of the other space, but they would never join up ever in all time. And I think it was just, again, just trying to experiment with the way we were using space. And again, the music came first. Leszek had written some music, and we decided that's the piece we wanted to use. And then we literally musicalized the way we approached the mise en scène, and that's how it happened.
Well, it's a fabulous introduction. So why don't we take a look at, this is about a quarter of the way through the comb from the Museums of Sleep, and I think you've got a good sense of where we are. It will be Terry Rafferty's favorite, too, is that it's simultaneously perhaps the most painterly of your works. I mean, it has a kind of richness of color, and I mean, it almost has a kind of Hieronymus Bosch range of motifs, and at the same time, it seems to reflect something that also was part of your work in this period, which is the work in theater. I mean, there's a kind of the sort of mise en scène, the kind of physical architectural space of the theater, of the sort of the top and the bottom, the pit and the flies seem to be very operative in this film. And I'm curious, but really, how does the kind of painterly puppet, more especially, how does that kind of theatrical part, the set design part, begin to enter into your filmmaking?
But I know after having done rehearsals, black and white, you had to go to color. That you just couldn't tolerate black and white again. But at the same time, we were doing some theater productions. We did an opera, which we did in almost as intense color as that. And I think it's probably, we realized that theater and puppet animation are actually closer than we imagined. I think at one point we thought we were just trying to cinematize puppets. And I think actually we realized that's why we set some of this inside an actual theatrical framework. We built a theater. And it was to find its focus in that context. But the stylization of theater and puppets, yes, became a kind of operative word at that point. Nothing to be embarrassed about.
No. I think also that what was, well, initially when we were asked to do the theater, the opera piece, it was The Love for Three Oranges by Prokofiev, which was quite a fantastic thing, opera. And the director, who knew our animation work, said to us, I mean, would we do it? And we said, not likely. And he said, but listen, I don't want you to ever think, don't do anything different than what you've done in your films. And that sort of relieved us. And that's how we accepted. But I think that after that, what fascinated us about the theater was there you are on a stage essentially like this, with maybe, say, 20 feet depth. And you say, in the best sense of the way the Baroque architects would work, in a limited space you can create the most fantastic space with all the illusions of depth. And I think that's, in a sense, what we wanted to work with in the comb, was working with trying to create, you know, a mixture between fabulous depths and sometimes no depth, and within a theatrical context. So again, it was an exploration.
When somebody says that, oh, that's Hieronymus Bosch-like, does that make you crazy, or is that permissible, or is that even helpful?
I don't think we thought once about Hieronymus Bosch, but I accept it. I mean, we know his work, so naturally it's a valid reference point, but with us we were working with these sort of what are they called, aniline dyes, and I think this one dye had gone off, and it created that very intense orange, and we just said, great, go for it.
Now, if Terry were here, he wouldn't have said Hieronymus Bosch. No, that's me now. But what would Terry have said? He would look at those motifs and he'd say, "Oh, that's not really Hieronymus Bosch." You know, the average Joe would think that's Hieronymus Bosch, but it's really what?
I don't know.
It could be Ensor.
Yeah.
Ensor. Okay. That's what Terry would have thought.
Yeah. What's he know?
You made a very unusual transition also in this period. You move into theater and set design for opera, but you also have a really, I would think, a very unlikely arena for your talents, and that's MTV. And I'm curious, what possessed the makers of music video to approach you to do a music video?
We were in Zagreb with Crocodiles, and MTV approached. I mean, I think being avaricious as they are, looking for unknown, ringers, to do something for free, or basically something like that. And they came up to us and said, "Do you want to do something for free, for a bit of exposure?" And it was one of those. I think we vaguely knew what MTV was. I mean, we saw it in London.
I think it's because the guy paid.
Italia.
I think the guy paid for our lunch.
That's right. You did, yeah. And so we felt really generous. We thought, yeah, we'll do it for free. And but he suggested something like one of those art breaks, like he said, a minute. And we said, yeah, a minute, that's fine. But we do it in black and white.
But we had to do also the logo thing.
One which spelled out the logo. So it was a deal. We had to do, that was the deviation side of it, and so we did one of each. We spelled out MTV, which is slightly silly, and then we did the one which was with the iron filings. But I gather that's not being shown. But,
no, we're going to look at, and I'm curious, kind of again. I mean, what should be obvious when we see it is, I mean, you make music videos in which there's no lip sync, there's no product tie-in, there's very little reference to the lyrics.
Oh, yes, there is.
Sort of. We're going to actually see all of, since these are among your shorter works, Are We Still Married, which you call Stille Nacht 2. And I'm just curious the kind of conceit of these short music films.
I think that the notion came from Stille Nacht being silent night, we imagined what would happen on Christmas Eve under the bed. And that was the original impulse for the very first one, with the iron filings. But it was also at the same time dedicated to Robert Walser, what we imagined, because he died on Christmas Day. It was a premonition of what was going to happen to him. So in a way, the Stille Nacht series was a kind of perpetration, that they would all be in black and white, and they would all be a bit bizarre, I suppose. Even traversing the range of pop video, which is slightly anti-Walser, but nevertheless we'd do it.
Okay, well let's take a look. This is Are We Still Married? In the.
Should we just say that this one, the guy, 4AD Records just called us up and said, would you do this? Would you do the whole album? And I think it was something like
30 minutes.
30 minutes, we said, not likely. You realize how long that would take? And he said, no, we don't know anything about animation. So then we said, well, we could only possibly do at the maximum one song. So he gave us the album, and we said that this cut here is something that we could do something with. So it was very, very informal. It cost £10,000, which is what, $15,000. And they just gave us carte blanche. They just said, give us an idea of what you're going to do, and we gave them one image and a few lines, and then they said, yeah, go ahead. And that's how it started. And the guy who is from Detroit, I don't think he even had anything to do with it, really. Did he? He didn't. It was all done through 4AD in London, and they just let us go. So that's really how it starts. It always just starts really banally with a phone call and us being unemployed. And we said, this is great. And again, you say, once we heard the music, we sat there and we thought a bit over a bottle of wine, and we just said, well, let's try something out along this line. And that's how it always starts, very banally.
Okay, let's take a look at Are We Still Married? The same faulty critical voice that asked about Hieronymus Bosch will probably ask, is that rabbit and the little girl in any way related to Lewis Carroll and, yes, Alice?
I must say, we never once thought about it. So everybody tells us, and then we realize that it does look like Alice in Wonderland. We never thought of it once.
But it's valid.
So the question is, what were you thinking of?
But it always starts off with us having, we had a whole fleet of rabbits and animals that we found in the market, and they were just lying on the side. We had the mannequin we found. We were working in Amsterdam in the Opera House, and it was in a flea market, and we bought it, but never thinking how you were going to use it. We just lugged it home, and then when the project came up, we just, you spun your head around, you saw the girl, and then you saw the rabbit, and you said, okay, two found objects, let's go. And we created, but it's totally valid to use the Alice in Wonderland.
But actually, the impulse was from a book on anonymous masterpieces of French photography, and it showed a girl in front of a door, and she was standing there, and behind her there was a door, but there was a white ball, and we thought ping pong ball and a ping pong racket or paddle. And that was the connection, and that's all we gave to the to 4AD, and that was the genesis of the idea.
That's really it's very spare for them to go on.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, they were desperate.
We didn't tell them what was going to happen either.
Yeah. Because we didn't know, but it was only £10,000. I guess they didn't have much of an option.
I should ask, there's a second one you did for that same group for His Name Is Alive, and I mean, in a way, I think Terry preferred this one. I actually like this one a little better. Was it a similar experience? I mean, you reprised the rabbit and the mannequin.
Yeah.
And pulled them out of mothballs, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It was the same budget thrown at us, and we just did part 2 of it, that's all. And we didn't have to provide a scenario this time.
We're in the hired gun segment of the excerpts, and we're probably going to see maybe the most, in a way, kind of clearly sponsored work of your career. It's a piece that was commissioned by the Getty and Metropolitan Museum of Art for their art on film. And it would seem to be a fairly straightforward project to do a 15-minute film on anamorphosis. But again, much as your work always moves in a slightly different direction than normative music videos and normative documentaries, this one too moves in that direction. We're going to see something that's maybe 2/3 of the way through, and I wonder if you could just briefly set up the project for us and tell us a little bit about this, and then we'll go into the excerpt.
It started off with the Getty Foundation approached us with the idea of drafting a project. It had to be pre-19th or pre-18th century, a theme, and we chose the art of anamorphosis, which is the use of I can't even remember now. The use of distorted perspective, and the way it was employed, and it goes back to the 1600s that they used. The famous works are you can find them in Rome, I don't know if the sequence has the sequence in Rome, but again, they gave us pretty much carte blanche. Although we had to use an art historian who was Ernst Gombrich.
Oh, I mean,
so we had this big heavyweight guy, drift into the studio, and having to sanction our errant sense of narrative on this one, but it all worked out, and we did. They gave us freedom, and but I'm not sure what the sequence is. Oh, it's the sequence.
It's the
St. Francis.
Trinità dei Monti.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, this is the sequence. There's above the Spanish Steps in Rome. There's a church which has in it a very interesting mural, an anamorphic mural of St. Francis, and it belongs now to it's a French school for kids, kindergarten kids, and we got permission to get in there, and we had a morning to shoot it, and as we were shooting it, we suddenly realized that everybody was going to say, I bet you guys did this as a model. It's not really live. And because it takes place in a hallway and there's a door, and there's this really wonderful French nun who ran the school, and we got along very well with her. And so we said at one point she had to walk down the corridor and go into the door, because we said it's the only way people will have a sense of scale of what the place looks like. So we sort of abducted her and said, go, and she walks down. And this was the one, in the whole film, was only one live action sequence that we were really able to do. All the rest was done as models, and that's it.
Great. Well, we're going to see that actual locale in the beginning of this, and we'll see it to the end.
The interesting thing about that painting, it's in the National Gallery in London, and it's hung. It's really stupid. They hang it so that you can't even approach it to see the skull on the right.
It's not even an artificially painted door on the right, huh?
No, there's no door. I mean, it's also hung 3 feet off the ground. It should be hung literally at ground level. And if you try to get to the right, there's no space, and the guards will shoo you away anyhow. So it's absurd that it's like that. But anyhow, see the film.
Exactly. I'm going to move on with your mention of directing this French sister into the larger arena of directing actors. By this time, your plans for your feature film had materialized, and you were actually able to begin production. While there are actors in some of the films before this. I mean, this is a fully acted, or as close to fully acted as one will imagine you will ever do. What was the experience of now not working on tabletop, the two of you, but actually directing human beings, and not only directing the people in front of the camera, but also presumably the technicians behind? How much of a change, how perhaps terrifying was it to have people who weren't made out of metal with their heads on armatures?
Did you ask Terry Gilliam this question? Yeah. No, because we'd worked in the theater, in the opera, so that we'd seen people inhabit the sets, and so it was that was the best transition one could make, and so when the feature came about, what we felt was really crucial was that we handpicked the team. So we chose the camera team, the production team, the costume designer who we'd worked with in the operas and the theater. So in a sense, they were on our side. They trusted us. They trusted our vision, and the actors for sure was an unknown quantum, but again, we handpicked them, and just by talking with them, you had their complicity. And I think it was best that, I don't think we had any idea which way it was going to go. You were just locked in on being really powerfully focused on the vision that you'd worked up in the script, and that it just happened so quickly in a way that. But we did have in animation, it takes, if you do a second or third take, it takes days and hours and hours and hours. And the great, it was nothing to say, go ahead, do 13 takes. That was nice, building like that was wonderful. But
Who did the directing? This is actually one of those questions you ask, you have like the Coen brothers. Okay, which one of you, says, okay, action, and which one of you is, maybe, working on storyboards or, checking designs?
We conferred back and forth, but one of us actually chose to deal with the actors, and the other chose to deal with the camera crew. So in that way, you maintain the visuality, and then to go back to the monitor, and then that's where all the other work happened.
But on the whole time that we did this film, we shot in an old dilapidated mansion outside of London, opposite Hampton Court Palace. And this was an old, it was one of the English kings, we don't know our history, that had a mistress, and apparently there's a tunnel between the two houses. But this house is used for pop promos and TV programs, and it was rented for 12 weeks. We did pre-production for 6 weeks, building the sets inside the place, and then we shot the live action for 6 weeks, and then we went back into our studio, and then shot for 3 months all the close-ups, there's some invisible animation work, and that's it.
We're going to see a section that comes very late in the film, and maybe it's of use to say that the storyline and so on.
Oh yeah, I think probably very quickly we should say that it was based off of a novella by Robert Walser called Jakob van Guten, and really it's about a young person enrolling in a school for the training of servants to be zeros in life, and that within that framework, Walser did a reworking of the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, so that you have Lise Benjamente, who's who you will see in this scene, and there's the 7 dwarves who are the students, and Jakob is the sort of princeling character who arrives supposedly with a kiss of life, and it's the kiss of death, and that was the fairy tale-ish elements that we wanted to work with on this film.
Well, I think on that note, I'm going to thank Timothy and Stephen for coming to the Twin Cities to spend an evening with us, to allow us to share a section of their new work and the extraordinary work that they've done over the last decade and a half, and to really give us an insight into a rather extraordinary working process, and to bear with foolish questions on this end too. Many, many thanks.
Nice.
Thank you.